My grandmother's will was, I thought, a final, gentle insult. She left the bulk of her fortune to a mysterious trust and left me her beat-up old car with a bizarre final errand to hand-deliver 5 sealed letters to 5 strangers. I thought it was a pointless, sentimental waste of time. I had no idea it was actually a map that would lead me away from the man I was and towards a future I never knew I wanted. Before we hit the road, I'd love to know, what city are you watching from today? And be sure to subscribe for our daily stories. Okay, let's head to that lawyer's office. The day my grandmother Hazel's will was read was the day my own carefully constructed 5-year plan was supposed to finally come to fruition. I sat in the stuffy wood-paneled office of her estate lawyer, a man as old and as dusty as the law books that lined his walls, and I did the math in my head. I was 28 years old, a junior vice president at a competitive investment firm, and I was good at my job. I was ruthless. I saw the world as a series of assets and liabilities. And my grandmother's passing, as much as I had loved her, was, in the cold, hard calculus of my life, a major asset. I had been planning my exit strategy for a year. The inheritance I was expecting, a sum I had conservatively estimated in the low 7 figures, was going to be my seed money. I would quit my job, start my own leaner, meaner firm, and I would finally and truly begin my life. I loved my grandmother. I did. But I had always seen her as a woman of profound, impractical sentiment. Her life was a collection of stray cats, of half-finished paintings, of a quiet and, in my opinion, unprofitable generosity. She saw the world as a place of stories. I saw it as a marketplace. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Thompson, finally cleared his throat and began to read. I pretended to listen, my gaze fixed on his face with a look of somber respect. But in my mind, I was already choosing the square footage for my new office. He read through a series of small, predictable bequests to a litany of her favorite and equally sentimental charities, and then he came to the main event. "The bulk of my remaining estate," he read, his voice a dry, reedy thing. "A portfolio currently valued at approximately $8 million, is to be placed in a discretionary trust to be managed by this firm." I leaned forward slightly, my heart giving a single, hard, and greedy thump. "To my only and beloved grandson, Owen," the lawyer continued, and I held my breath. "I leave 2 items." 2 items? "First," he said, "my 1988 Volvo station wagon, with all my love, in the hopes that it will remind him that the most valuable journeys are not always the fastest." I just stared at him. The Volvo, a 30-year-old boat-like car that smelled of wet dog and old books. It was a joke, a terrible, senile joke. "And second," the lawyer said, as he reached down and placed a small, simple, and beautifully carved wooden box on the polished surface of the desk, "I leave him this, with a single, final, and legally binding condition." I looked at the box, then at the lawyer. My own 5-year plan, my entire future, was a smoking, catastrophic ruin. I had been so close. I stood up, a dismissive rage settling in my chest. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Thompson," I said, my voice a clipped professional instrument. "You may keep the car and the box. I am not interested in my grandmother's sentimental games." I was about to walk out of that office, out of her life, out of the whole ridiculous, disappointing story.
"Mr. Hayes," the lawyer's voice stopped me at the door. "I believe you'll want to hear the condition." He looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. "Access to the $8 million trust and your ability to be named its sole director," he said, his voice a quiet, final checkmate, is entirely and completely contingent upon your successful completion of the task she has left for you in that box. I walked back to the desk, a prisoner to a dead woman's final and deeply infuriating whim. I opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded blue velvet, were 5 thick and formally sealed envelopes. Each was addressed to a different person, a name I had never heard, in a different, small, and completely obscure town I had never heard of. I looked at the lawyer, then at the ridiculous wooden box on the table. It was a bizarre, posthumous piece of emotional blackmail, a final, frustrating lesson from a woman who had always been trying to teach me a lesson I had never wanted to learn. But the money, the real money, my money, was tied to it. I didn't have a choice. I took the keys to the old, ridiculous car. I took the box of strange, inconvenient letters. I had no idea that my grandmother hadn't just sent me on a wild goose chase. I walked out of the lawyer's office and into the harsh afternoon sunlight, the keys to my grandmother's 30-year-old Volvo station wagon feeling like a small and deeply insulting weight in my hand. The wooden box of letters was under my other arm. It was, I had decided, a bizarre, inefficient form of posthumous emotional blackmail. But the $8 million, my $8 million, was tied to it. So I would play her sentimental little game. The car was parked in the lawyer's private garage, a dusty, boat-like and profoundly beige relic from another century, surrounded by a fleet of sleek, modern, and German-engineered symbols of success. My own car was a Porsche. This was a particular, and, I was sure, very deliberate kind of humiliation. The first leg of the journey was a quiet, seething torture. The car had no GPS, no satellite radio, no climate control. It just had a cassette player and a box of my grandmother's old and terrible folk music tapes. The slow, lumbering pace of the old Volvo on the interstate was a special kind of hell for a man whose entire life was a relentless and obsessive pursuit of moving faster and acquiring more than everyone else. I looked at the first of the 5 envelopes in the wooden box on the passenger seat. The address was for a man named Mr. Arturo Rossi, in a small, forgotten, unpronounceable Rust Belt town in the middle of Ohio, a town I would normally only ever see as a small, insignificant blur from the window of a plane on my way to somewhere important. I arrived in the town 2 days later. It was a place that time and the economy had clearly forgotten. The main street was a sad collection of boarded-up storefronts and a few lonely surviving businesses. And one of those businesses, a small but clean and well-kept Italian bakery, was my destination. I walked in, the bell above the door chiming a cheerful, old-fashioned sound. The air was thick with the warm, beautiful, and life-affirming scent of fresh-baked bread. An elderly man, his hands, his apron, and his magnificent white mustache all dusted with a fine layer of flour, looked up from the counter where he was kneading dough. "I'm looking for an Arturo Rossi," I said, my voice the clipped, efficient tone of a man who did not have time for pleasantries. "You have found him," the old man said, his own voice a warm and heavily accented baritone. "What can I do for you?" I placed the sealed, cream-colored envelope on the counter between us. "I was asked to deliver this to you," I said. "It's from a woman named Hazel Hayes." The old baker froze, his hands still buried in the dough. He looked at the envelope and then up at me, and his own kind, dark eyes began to fill with a sudden and surprising emotion. "Hazel," he whispered, "the name a prayer, a ghost. My God, I have not heard that name in 30 years. With hands that were now trembling slightly, he wiped the flour from his fingers and carefully, almost reverently, took the letter. He broke the seal. He read. And then he began to weep. Not with a loud, dramatic wail, but with the silent, profound, moving sobs of a man who had just been given an impossible and long-forgotten gift. He then, through his tears, told me the story. He told me of a day, 30 years ago, when he had been a young, penniless Italian immigrant with a dream of opening his own bakery. He told me of the banks that had laughed at him, of the loan officers who had turned him away. He had been about to give up, and then she had walked in. A young woman, a complete stranger with bright, kind eyes. My grandmother. She had tasted his bread, she had listened to his story, and then she had done something impossible. She had written him a personal check for $10,000, an anonymous, interest-free loan. The world needs more beauty, she had told him, and your bread is a beautiful thing. That money, he told me, had been the start of everything. Of his bakery, of his life in this new country, of his own family. This letter, he said, his voice a choked, grateful whisper as he held up the paper, it is the original loan document, and at the bottom she has written one final word. She showed it to me. Forgiven. I sat in that ridiculous 30-year-old car, the scent of fresh-baked bread and my grandmother's quiet, secret, and breathtaking decency still clinging to my expensive and suddenly very shallow-feeling suit. The old man's tears, his story of my grandmother's impossible, unprofitable kindness, it was a data point that did not fit into my own carefully constructed and cynical algorithm of the world. I looked at the 4 other sealed letters still sitting in the wooden box on the passenger seat. They were no longer just a series of inconvenient, frustrating errands. They were a mystery, a puzzle, a map of a woman I had loved, but I was now beginning to realize I had never, ever truly known. And for the very first time in my entire ambitious, impoverished life, I felt a strange and unsettling and profoundly compelling need to find out exactly what was inside. I drove out of that small, forgotten Ohio town with the ghost of my grandmother sitting in the passenger seat. The car, her car, which had felt like a prison just a day before, now felt different. It was a time capsule. I looked at the worn dashboard, at the faded upholstery, and I tried to picture her, a young woman, driving these same roads, on her way to change a stranger's life with a quiet, anonymous act of grace. The thought was so at odds with the woman I thought I knew that it made my head ache. The next letter in the box was addressed to a woman named Isabel Rivas, in a small, artsy-looking town nestled in the mountains of North Carolina. It was a 2-day drive. For the first time on the trip, I didn't feel the crushing, impatient weight of the time I was losing. Instead, I put in one of her old folk music tapes, and I listened. The music was simple, full of stories of heartache and hope, and it was the soundtrack to a part of her life I had never bothered to ask about. I found the address on a quiet, tree-lined street. It was a small, charming, but slightly run-down bungalow with a porch that was overflowing with potted plants and wind chimes. As I walked up the path, I could hear the sound of an acoustic guitar and a woman's clear, beautiful voice singing a sad, sweet song from within. I knocked. The music stopped. A moment later, the door opened, and a woman in her late 30s, with kind, tired eyes, and a guitar still slung over her shoulder, looked out at me with a wary, questioning expression. A small child, a little girl, peeked out from behind her legs. "Isabel Rivas?" I asked. "Yes," she said, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's head. I did not know what to say. I was just a man in a suit, an intruder from another world, so I just held out the letter.
"My name is Owen Hayes," I said. "My grandmother, Hazel, asked me to give this to you." She took the letter, her expression a mixture of confusion and a dawning fragile hope. She opened it. I watched as her eyes scanned the page, and her entire body seemed to relax. A tension I hadn't even noticed she was carrying, simply melting away. She did not weep, like the baker had. She just smiled. A slow, brilliant, and unbelievably beautiful smile of pure, unadulterated relief. "I knew she was a real person," she whispered, more to herself than to me. "I always knew she was real." She invited me in for a cup of tea, and she told me her story. She had been a young, struggling musician, a single mother with a mountain of student loan debt and a sick child. She had been on the verge of giving up on her music, of selling her guitar and getting a real job, when the first letter arrived. It was from a lawyer. An anonymous benefactor, the letter had explained, had paid off her entire student loan debt. A year later, another letter arrived. The same benefactor had paid off the mortgage on her small house. "It was like having a guardian angel," she said, her voice full of a quiet, wondrous awe. "It was the gift of freedom. It allowed me to not just survive, but to create, to be a full-time mother and a full-time musician." The letter I had just delivered, she explained, contained the final, paid-in-full deed to her home and a simple handwritten note. She showed it to me. "The world needs more beauty," my grandmother's familiar script read. "And your music is a beautiful thing. Now you are free to make it. H." I left her small, happy house an hour later, the sound of her beautiful, hopeful music following me down the path. As I was getting back into my car, she called out to me, "Mr. Hayes!" I turned. "Your grandmother," she said, a thoughtful, knowing look in her eyes. "She spoke of you once in one of her letters. The lawyer would sometimes include a personal note from her." I just stared, my own heart giving a strange, unexpected lurch. "She said you had a brilliant mind for numbers," Isabel recalled, "but a heart that was still learning how to count what truly matters." I drove away from the musician's small, happy house, her words, my grandmother's words, echoing in the quiet of the car. A heart that was still learning how to count what truly matters. It was not a criticism. It was a lesson, a final piece of homework from the wisest teacher I had ever known. I looked at the 3 other sealed letters still sitting in the wooden box on the passenger seat. My journey was no longer a mystery. It was an education. And I was, for the very first time in my life, finally starting to understand the curriculum. The drive from North Carolina to a small, dusty farming town in Kansas was a long and surprisingly contemplative one. I drove with the windows of the old Volvo down, the folk music from my grandmother's cassette tapes, a quiet, rustic soundtrack to the vast open country. I was no longer the impatient, angry man who had left the lawyer's office a week ago. That man was a stranger to me now. I was a pilgrim, a collector of my own grandmother's secret stories. And I was beginning to understand that her true fortune was not the one sitting in a trust fund. It was the one that was scattered in small, beautiful pieces all across this country. The third letter was addressed to a family named Al-Jamil. I found their address on the town's main street. It was a small, bustling, and wonderfully fragrant Middle Eastern grocery store. A man with a kind, weathered face and a warm, welcoming smile greeted me from behind the counter. I handed him the letter. He read it, and his eyes filled with tears. He then pulled me into a hug, a gesture of such profound and immediate gratitude that it took me by surprise. He then, with his wife and his 3 beautiful children at his side, told me their story. They had been refugees.
a family who had lost everything in a war I had only ever read about in the newspapers. They had come to this country with nothing, and my grandmother, Hazel, had been their official sponsor. But she had been more than that. She had been their first and their only friend. She had helped them find this small storefront. She had given them the interest-free loan to start their business. She had, he told me, his voice thick with emotion, given them back their future. The letter I had just delivered, I learned, contained a fully funded college trust for all three of his children. I left their small, beautiful shop with my own heart full and a bag filled with the most delicious baklava I have ever tasted. The fourth letter was a different kind of story. It took me to a gray, gritty, and industrial city in Michigan, to a place that felt a world away from the sun-drenched plains of Kansas. The address was a community center in a rough and clearly very poor part of the city. The man I was looking for, a Mr. Peterson, was a tough, no-nonsense, and intimidating-looking man in his late 60s who ran the center with the disciplined authority of a drill sergeant. He was not a man who wept. He read the letter from my grandmother with a grim and unreadable expression. "Hazel," he said, shaking his head, a small, gruff, and almost imperceptible smile on his face. Always had to have the last word, didn't she? He then told me a story that completely and totally shattered the last of my own preconceived notions about my quiet, gentle grandmother. He and my grandmother, 30 years ago, had been business rivals, fierce and often ruthless competitors in the commercial real estate world, and she, he told me, had beaten him. In a single, brilliant and strategic deal, she had outmaneuvered him and had in the process destroyed his company. He had lost everything. He had been a broken and a very bitter man. Years later, she had found him. He had thought she had come to gloat, but she had not. She had come with a proposition. She had bought this old abandoned building, and she had offered to fund this community center, a place for the at-risk youth of his own forgotten hometown, on one condition, that he be the one to run it. "I always respected you, Peterson," she had told him. "You were a good fighter. Now it's time to fight for something that actually matters."
The letter I had just delivered, he told me, contained a final, massive, and completely anonymous donation to the center's endowment fund, a sum that would guarantee its existence for the next 20 years. I walked out of that community center, my mind reeling. My grandmother had not just been a kind, sentimental woman. She had been a brilliant and profoundly compassionate businesswoman. She had not just given handouts, she had created opportunities. She had redeemed her rivals. She had, in her own quiet, powerful way, been changing the world, one small, secret act at a time. I was on the last leg of my journey now, the long, final drive back home. I had one letter left in the small wooden box on the passenger seat. I picked up the final, sealed envelope, and my blood ran cold. The letter was not addressed to a stranger in a distant, forgotten town. The elegant, familiar, and beautiful script on the front of the envelope was an address I knew all too well. It was my own, my expensive, high-rise, empty apartment. And the name, the final name on my grandmother's list, was not a stranger's. It was mine. Owen Hayes. I stared at my own name written in my grandmother's hand. This entire journey, this long, strange, transformative pilgrimage across the country, it had all, in the end, been leading me right back to myself. The first 4 letters had been about her past, but this one, this final and still unopened letter, this was about my future. And I was suddenly and completely and totally terrified to find out what was inside. I drove the final leg of my journey in a state of quiet, contemplative silence.
The angry, impatient man who had started this trip a week ago, the man who had cursed this old, slow car, was gone. I was someone else now, a man who had been hollowed out and then refilled with the stories and the quiet, profound decency of a woman I was only just beginning to understand. I arrived back in my own city, a place that now felt foreign and strange. My own sleek German sports car was waiting for me in the garage of my high-rise apartment building, a silent, glittering monument to a life I no longer recognized. I parked my grandmother's dusty 30-year-old Volvo beside it, and I knew in that moment that the old beat-up station wagon, the car that smelled of wet dog and old box, was the most valuable thing I owned. I went up to my apartment. It was a space I had once been so proud of, a minimalist and brutally expensive testament to my own success. It was all clean lines and cold glass and a stunning panoramic view of a city I had wanted to conquer. Now it just felt empty. The wooden box with the final, fifth letter sat on my polished concrete coffee table. My own name, Owen Hayes, written in my grandmother's familiar, elegant script, stared up at me. This entire journey, this long, strange, transformative pilgrimage across the country, it had all, in the end, been leading me right back here. The first 4 letters had been about her past, but this one, this final and still unopened letter, this was about my future. And I was, for the first time on this entire trip, truly afraid to find out what was inside. With a hand that was not entirely steady, I opened the final envelope.
"My dearest, dearest Owen," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means you have done it. It means you have completed your journey, and it means you have met the people who were the true and most valuable treasures of my life. I hope you listened to their stories. I hope you saw the beauty in their small and quiet and profoundly decent lives. I must apologize, my boy, for this strange and manipulative final errand, but I knew it was the only way. I have watched you for years, my brilliant, ambitious, unhappy grandson. I have watched you build a fortress of success around your own heart. I could not leave you my fortune. Not yet. Not until I was certain I had first given you a small piece of my own soul. The baker, the musician, the refugee family, your old rival, they were not just errands, Owen. They were your education. I needed you to see with your own 2 eyes that the greatest investments in this world are not the ones that offer a financial return, but the ones that offer a human one. I needed you to understand that true wealth is not the money you accumulate in a bank account, but the quiet and often unseen good you put out into the world. I needed you to learn how to count what truly and everlastingly matters. I had to stop reading, the paper in my hand trembling, a hot, shameful tear blurring the ink of her final, beautiful words. "The money in the trust," the letter concluded, "the $8 million, it is now yours to command. The lawyer, Mr. Thompson, has been instructed to transfer the directorship of the trust to you, effective today. I did not just leave this money to you in my will, my darling boy. I made you earn it, not with your brilliant mind for business, but with your good and true and newly remembered heart. What you do with it now will be the final and most important testament to the man you have become. Make me proud." I finished the letter, and the tears I had been holding back from my entire adult life finally and completely came. I was not crying for the money. I was crying for her, for the profound, strategic, and unconditional love of the woman I had so badly and so completely misunderstood. I was not just her grandson anymore. I was her student, and I had, finally, after a long and very difficult, beautiful final exam, graduated. I looked at my grandmother's letter, at the keys to an $8 million kingdom she had just so cleverly and so lovingly placed in my hands.
The old Owen, the man who had left on this trip a week ago, he would have called his broker. He would have started a new company, a new and bigger and emptier empire. But the old Owen was gone, a ghost left behind in a series of small and forgotten and profoundly decent towns all across the country. I picked up my phone, and I dialed the number for the lawyer, Mr. Thompson. I knew with an absolute and total certainty what my very first act as the new director of my grandmother's trust was going to be. And it had absolutely nothing to do with making money. It had everything to do with giving it away. My phone call to the lawyer, Mr. Thompson, was brief, and to him, I am sure, utterly baffling. I did not ask about the transfer of funds. I did not ask about the legal mechanisms of the trust. I told him I wanted to change its name. "It's not just a trust anymore, Mr. Thompson," I had said, a new and unfamiliar sense of purpose in my own voice. "As of today, it is a foundation. The Hazel Hayes Foundation for Small Dreams."
The weeks that followed were a quiet, satisfying demolition of my old life. I walked into my corner office at the investment firm, the office I had fought so hard for, and I resigned. I sold my sleek and soulless Porsche, and I sold the expensive, high-rise apartment with its beautiful, panoramic, lonely view of the city. And I kept the Volvo. My new life was a world away from the one I had known. It was a life of small towns, of quiet conversations, of listening. I used my grandmother's fortune, my fortune, to continue her work. I became the quiet, anonymous benefactor. I found a young, brilliant chef who was about to lose her restaurant, and I paid off her debts. I found a small, independent bookstore that was about to be crushed by a large, corporate chain, and I bought their building for them. I was not just giving away money. I was investing, for the first time in my life, in the beautiful and deeply human business of hope. The story ends on a warm, sunny afternoon, a year after my journey began. I am driving the old, beloved, and still slightly smelling of wet dog Volvo station wagon down a quiet country road. The wooden box my grandmother left me is sitting on the passenger seat beside me, its 5 original letters now replaced by a stack of new ones. New stories, new possibilities. I am on my way to the first official annual board meeting of the Hazel Hayes Foundation. I pull up to a small, charming, and beautifully restored farmhouse. It is the new headquarters for the foundation. And waiting for me on the porch are my new board of directors. Mr. Rossi, the old Italian baker, is there, a large box of his famous cannolis in his hands. Isabel Rivas, the musician, is there, her guitar slung over her shoulder, her daughter playing in the yard. The Al-Jamil family is there, their own children now a year older, their futures bright and full of a promise my grandmother had given them. And my grandmother's old rival, the gruff and surprisingly wise Mr. Peterson, is there, a look of quiet, respectful approval on his face. These were my people now, my partners, my family. I think back to that day in the lawyer's office, to the cynical, greedy young man who had been so disappointed by a beat-up old car and a box of letters. He had been so desperate to find his fortune, to start his own brilliant career. He had had no idea that his grandmother, in her infinite, strategic love for him, had left him something far, far more valuable. She had not left him a business to run. She had left him a life to live. And as I looked at the faces of the good and decent and wonderfully ordinary people gathered on that porch, the living, breathing legacy of her secret, beautiful life, I knew, with a certainty that was as warm and as bright as the afternoon sun, that I had finally and truly inherited the family fortune.
An absolutely beautiful and moving story about a journey that was about more than just delivering letters. It was about discovering a legacy. What a powerful transformation for Owen. What do you think of the grandmother's final, brilliant lesson for her grandson? Let us know in the comments below. If you were moved by this incredible, feel-good story, please show your support by hitting that like button. And be sure to subscribe for more uplifting and powerful stories. Don't forget to click the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.